I'm interested in ambivalent sexism, which is a relatively recent development in the conceptualization and measurement of sexism, new-ish to political science, not quite so new in social psychology. And I'll be talking about the election in 2016. So I'll start with the shocking observation that gender was highly salient in 2016. And I won't fill in the slide with all the details of this, but just note the way that in addition to Hillary Clinton embodying, going back to the 90s, debates around changing gender roles in society, and Donald Trump's history of sexist remarks and accusations of harassment and assault, he also embodied in many ways a certain vision of masculine dominance and aggression. And also kind of symbolically linked that masculine power with state power. So, at levels from kind of the surface down to the more deeply symbolic, gender and kind of gendered ideas were running through the campaign. And yet, the bottom line from tons of work on candidate sex category, that is to say male and female candidates, is that when women run, women win. And so much, so when women are, when they campaign similarly to similarly situated male candidates. Media treats them relatively similarly. Voters don't seem to vote against female candidates solely because they are female. It's based on lots of experimental work, observational work, and nicely kind of brought together in Hayes and Lawless 2016. That said, we know surprisingly little. I was actually shocked to see how little we know about voter-level sexism and individual differences in voter-level sexism on the one hand and candidate choice on the other hand. So there's been a ton of work on the 2016 general election and a little bit less on the 2016 primary. I list a bunch. I'm sure there are 12 more working papers this week. But surprisingly little before 2016 or below the level of the president. There's a little bit of work back in the 70s, a few analyses that, among other things, sort of touch on some measure of individual level sexism among voters. But we know relatively little about this. And so my pitch here is not so much, oh wow, sexism mattered for the presidential election in 2016, which you probably already believe, but to suggest both that how we understand sexism should be more complex than it might already be on the one hand, and to suggest that below the level of president, this matters as well in ways that suggest that the presidential election in 2016, though kind of highly gendered in many ways, is not unique in that way. So I'm going to start briefly by alluding to the kind of traditional definition or understanding of prejudice that we generally many scholars and most citizens bring to their understanding of prejudice, which is that articulated by Gordon Allport in 1954, suggesting that prejudice is an antipathy based on faulty and inflexible generalization. It may be felt or expressed. It may be directed toward a group or an individual of that group. And so the dominant emotions here are hostility and anger. And in the American politics literature on racial prejudice, there's been tons of debate about conceptualization and about measurement, but almost none of that debate has really taken issue with this idea that prejudice is at its core hostile and angry, right? So it may or may not be a faulty generalization. It may or may not apply to all individuals in the group. It may be linked with core American values or not. Lots of debates about that, but this hostile character is not really much discussed. And yet, in the case of gender, Burns and Gallagher, summarizing work by many scholars on gender and society, suggest that the social organization of gender, the way gender is organized, shapes views about gender in some ways that differ importantly from the case of race and therefore of the kind of case that Allport is talking about. So, right, gender involves role segregation rather than spatial segregation, mixed with intimacy. And it's a hierarchy, but it's one perpetuated in families with people we love, right? Not just with the other, so to speak. And that means that the hierarchy of gender is accommodated not just by those at the top, but also by those at the bottom, by women themselves. And they make the explicit point that this is in comparison with race, which is managed through spatial segregation and separation. Right? So this social structure generates ambivalent beliefs about women, right? Where and so Glick and Fisk, social psychologist, among many others, developed the concept of ambivalent sexism to suggest that there are two faces to the kind of thinking about women. One is hostile sexism, right? This is overtly hostile. It's probably what comes to mind when we think sexism. But then the other face they suggest is what they call benevolent sexism, which is subjectively positive, yet disempowering. So they suggest the subjective positivity is the benevolent, but the fact that it's fundamentally disempowering is why they classify it as sexism. And so they suggest that this includes a set of beliefs about gender differentiation. This is this role segregation, that men and women are sort of fundamentally different. That heterosexual intimacy, that men and women are and should be linked intimately in heterosexual context, and most important for my purposes, an idea of protective paternalism, this idea that men can and should protect benevolently the women that they are associated with. So we can think of benevolent sexism as, putting women on a pedestal, which is positive at a level, emotionally positive, but disempowering at the same time. And they suggest that this the ambivalence here of hostile and benevolent feelings toward the same type of target, women, is resolved by subtyping women. So women are categorized as either good or bad. Hostile sexism is directed at bad or non-traditional women. Benevolent sexism is directed toward good or traditional women. And so this generates polarized evaluations of women, right? So working women, feminists, bitch, would be the target of hostile sexism. In particular, what draws hostile sexism is the belief that someone is undermining the traditional gender hierarchy. Benevolent sexism, on the other hand, is directed at traditional women who reinforce that hierarchy. Housewives, mom, ladies, so forth. This also has implications, though, not just for perceptions of women, but also perceptions of men, right? So if women have a prescribed set of roles in this ambivalently sexist worldview, men do as well. They're expected to sacrifice and protect and cherish the good women in their lives and to be strong and powerful enough to do so. Bad men, on the other hand, threaten or harm those good women. Women, on the other hand, good women defer to men, maintain purity, and therefore deserve protection, where bad women threaten the gender hierarchy and deserve punishment. So you can think of it as a sort of chivalry metaphor, with the knight in shining armor who protects the damsel in distress who's being threatened by the dastardly other man, who is often a man of color. So these beliefs sort of intersect with ideas about race and ethnicity as well. And I'll have about one more sentence to say about that at the end. So Mary Jackman calls this the velvet glove of benevolent sexism. Iris Marion Young writes about the logic of masculinist protection that sort of very much are consistent with this account of the nature of views about gender and gender relations. So there's a ton of work a moderately large amount of work in social psych on benevolent sexism. One example is that benevolent sexism predicts victim blame in acquaintance rape vignettes. So people read a vignette about a sort of acquaintance rape that's designed to sort of seem a little bit ambiguous about exactly the nature of the situation and the nature of consent. And the higher a respondent is in benevolent sexism, the more they blame the victim. So there's a sense in which this benevolent sexism involves a kind of system justification set of beliefs where, well, if it was ambiguous and she was raped, she probably was asking for it in some way, a sort of judgment, recategorizing of the victim here as bad and therefore not deserving of protection. But benevolent sexism does not predict reactions in a stranger rape vignette. So it's in this ambiguous situation where the woman might be good, might be bad, that benevolent sexism gets engaged. And that result is mediated by perceptions of the victim. So when the victim is perceived as having, in some sense, deserved or asked for the assault, benevolent sexists blame her. When they don't, they don't. Both also are related to abortion, elective abortion, and other sorts of kind of gender-related and relationship-related outcome variables. So back to Trump, I just want to note briefly that, of course, he's hostile toward women, but that's mixed with a history of sort of, again, purportedly or seemingly positive remarks about women, where, you know, for example, in the October 2015 debate, where he said he respects women more than he respects men, and that he has great respect, admiration, and I cherish women, right? So this claim, at least, that, you know, quite to the contrary, he's not sexist, he cherishes women, which is consistent with the polarized view where the hostile remarks are directed at women he sees as undermining masculine authority, the positive remarks toward women who look and act the part of pure, to be cherished woman. Okay, so my analyses. I'm going to present some results from the presidential level in terms of both emotional reactions to and evaluations of the candidates, as well as vote choice. Also congressional level, vote choice and evaluation of one's current member of Congress. And then an experiment using fictitious candidates as well, where people are choosing between fictitious candidates. These data based on the 2016 CCES, an online survey conducted by YouGov with a nationally representative sample through sample matching, or a nationally representative sample through sample matching. Anyway, so in the University of Virginia module, which was 1,500 respondents, I included a short version of the ambivalent sexism inventory to measure hostile and benevolent sexism, my experiment, and some presidential level measures. I want to thank Craig Volden, who generously shared space on his module with me. So there's thanks to Craig that we're here, or that I'm here today in any case. So to measure ambivalent sexism, I modified and adapted from Glick and Fisk's 22-item ambivalence. So they have 11 items for hostile, 11 items for benevolent. I boiled those down and tinkered with them a bit to generate these. Just want to point out the ways that hostile sexism, right, points or emphasizes hostility, of course, and kind of points to ways that women might be undermining gendered authority with both of these, as well as sort of an acknowledgement of discrimination, and an item that is essentially an evaluation of feminists who should be disliked by hostile sexists particularly. Benevolent sexism, on the other hand, the women have a quality of purity that few men possess, and compared to men, women tend to have a superior moral sensibility. These suggest the kind of moral purity. And then the protective paternalism is picked up, and the men have no special obligation to provide financially for the women in their lives. Of course, that's reverse coded. And an item about whether men should cherish and protect women. Sort of, as it happens, Trump was channeling items from the benevolent sexism inventory when talking about how he cherishes women. So in the 2016 CCES, here's the distribution of both of these. So the things to note here is both of them have pretty good variance. Benevolent sexism has a higher mean, about 0.57, hostile lower, about 0.42. But it is not the case that sort of hostile or benevolent sexism has kind of disappeared among the public. There's also a bit of a gender difference, especially on hostile sexism. So men are quite a bit more hostily sexist than women, though again, women are not all at the low end of the scale by any means. Benevolent, they're pretty similar. Women are actually, their mean is about 0.05 on a 0-1 scale higher than men, so they're slightly more benevolently sexist than women, though the difference is not significant. Okay, so presidential level results. I've got a set of 5 dependent variables, thermometer ratings of each candidate, questions about whether either candidate has made you feel angry or disgusted, and then a vote choice question. And then I created a scale that's simply the average of those 5 items. And I run OLS or Probit as appropriate, with a model that includes hostile sexism, benevolent sexism, the CCS's somewhat funky measure of racism, a sociotropic economics evaluation scale, so that's basically how you think the economy as a whole is doing, personal financial situation, party ID, and the respondent's sex. So, you may or may not be actually able to read the text, but the slopey lines kind of tell the story here. So this is Clinton thermometer rating, Clinton negative emotional reactions, Trump thermometer rating, Trump negative emotional reactions, voting for Clinton in the 2-party vote, and then rolling everything together into a pro-Clinton scale. This is the top row, the impact of hostile sexism, holding constant all that other stuff in the model. We see across, and the 5th and 95th percentile of hostile sexism are the points that are labeled. So basically, we see across the board big, strong, statistically significant impacts for hostile sexism on all of these things, particularly on the emotional reactions, but really across the board. Benevolent sexism, on the other hand, has a somewhat less consistent impact. So it has its biggest impact on negative reactions to Trump, also a reasonably large impact on emotional reactions to Clinton, but not much impact on the Clinton thermometer rating, though it does on Trump. So more Trump than Clinton, and more emotion than rating. But again, so it matters, not quite to the extent that hostile sexism does. Here, this is the pro-Clinton scale. So this is the DV is that final column. It's the pro-Clinton scale, and this is the marginal effect of each of the variables in the model, basically to make the point that hostile sexism with a coefficient of negative 0.296, and benevolent with negative 0.162. The impact of those two combined is in the ballpark with the impact of racism or of sociotropic economic evaluations. Personal finances have a pretty small effect. Party ID, also the difference between Democrats and Republicans, again, is of roughly the same magnitude as the impact of hostile and benevolent. Yes, question?
I'm just trying to find out where you classify Clinton in one regard. There were a lot of comments made about her, namely her husband, and that she performed poorly in that regard in terms of her treatment and so on. How do you classify that set of questions and discussion and evaluation of her? Is it a hostile sexism? Is it a benevolent sexism? Is it not part of your model? How do you handle that?
So I don't have data. So I think that's an interesting question about the sort of place of Hillary Clinton in the universe of gender beliefs. And so I'll answer briefly now. I'd be happy to come back to that at the end. So I don't have any data that sort of unpacks Hillary Clinton's image or the sort of complexities of that image above and beyond kind of just the more hostily sexist you are, the less you like Clinton, the more you like Trump. However, I did, back in grad school, had a conference paper that looked at the role of a different measure of essentially sexism on Clinton before and after the Lewinsky scandal. And what I found was that gender traditionalists, or those higher in sexism, actually got more positive toward Clinton once she stood by her man, right? So that would suggest that claims that she sort of did badly by Clinton or didn't stand by him or shouldn't have stood by him might well draw hostile, I would guess hostile sexism. But again, more work is needed. Yeah.
How highly correlated are hostile and benevolent sexism with party?
Good question. So they're...
the coefficient of Democrat and Republican just seems smaller than they should be, right?
Well, okay, so I don't have the correlation off the top of my head. They are correlated, but...
Not at like 0.8.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would want to say it's less, on a par, maybe a little less than the correlation of racism with party ID.
Okay.
Right, so yes, I mean, so this is a model where surely, there's some interaction among the independent variables. And I'm not in a position to tease those out. That said, I think a difference of 0.37, right, between Democrats and Republicans, holding constant two measures of sexism, racism, economic. I mean, that's still a pretty party's still doing a lot above and beyond all that other stuff. Yes.
Sort of similar. What's the correlation between hostile and benevolent sexism?
So hostile and benevolent in my sample are correlated negative 0.16, so barely negative or small negative correlation. Much of the Glick and Fisk work finds that they're in fact positively correlated, but most of that's with student samples, so it's a little hard to know if that's really a general finding. I would generally expect them to be positively correlated. And Glick and Fisk do as well, because although they're emotionally opposite, they both, they fit together into this sort of system. But so in my data, they're pretty separable, and the correlations between them, whether positive or negative, are usually pretty low. All right. Okay, so that probably didn't surprise you, given what we already know about 2016. So now I want to turn, 2016 presidential level, I want to turn to the congressional level. And so first, a model of House vote. So here I'm modeling the probability of voting for the Democratic candidate in the congressional race that one faces as a function of hostile sexism, benevolent sexism, each candidate's sex, and the interaction between hostile and benevolent and the candidate's sex, and then controlling for racism, party ID, all the same stuff, right? So basically, I'm interested in how male as opposed to female and female candidates differentially evoke hostile or benevolent sexism, or the impact of hostile sexism. Is it different when facing a male candidate as opposed to a female candidate? Probate, weighted, clustered by a congressional district. So first, this is the impact of hostile sexism on House vote. And so this is the probability of voting for the Democrat when the Democrat is running against a male Republican, right? So this is races with a male Republican, and the blue line is a male Democrat running against a male Republican. And so what we find here is the higher a respondent is in hostile sexism, the less likely they are to vote for the Democrat, i.e. the more likely they are to vote for the Republican. So in a two men running against each other race, hostile sexists lean somewhat Republican, even above and beyond party ID and the rest. But when they see a female Democrat running against a male Republican, that relationship is substantially increased, right? So the idea here is, yes, there's some baseline connection with sort of something partisan, but facing a female candidate kind of draws this out. And hostile sexists get much less likely to vote for the female candidate. Those who are low in hostile sexism get substantially more likely to vote for the female candidate. So the slope gets much steeper, and B, the work is being done on both ends of the scale, right? So low hostile sexists are getting more low hostile sexists are getting more pro-female candidate, high hostile sexists are getting more anti-female candidate. Yes?
I'm sorry for.
Meh?
So I see the respondent having two possible answers to your survey. Is there a third answer where you have an egalitarian attitude towards women?
Well,
Is-
I mean,
So
what do you mean so in the measurement of ambivalent sexism?
you have two measurements of sexism. Both of them are sexist.
Yes.
But neither one of those have an egalitarian attitude.
Well, to disagree.
Depends on the score.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, if you disagree with the sexist statements, then you're at the egalitarian end of the scale.
So you're there now?
Yeah. If you agree with them, you're here. And in fact, as you may, I went by kind of quickly, but in fact, half of the items agreeing with them puts you on this end. The other half of the items agreeing puts you on that end. So that acquiescence bias, yada yada. All right. Okay, so that's races with a male Republican, right? And so then we're just looking at as the Democratic candidate is male or female. Now this is races with a male Democrat and either a male or a female Republican. So the blue line, right, is just this same line, but transposed, because now we're saying a male Democrat running against a male Republican. What's the probability of voting for the Republican, right? So it's just the inverse. But when there's a female Republican running against a male Democrat, we see the impact of hostile sexism is flipped, right? So where high hostile sexists tend to prefer Republicans, if that Republican is a woman, not so much, right? And so, these confidence intervals overlap. The difference in slopes is significant, as well as the difference in evaluations at the high end here, right? So this is, I think, pretty good evidence that hostile sexism, that the gender of the candidate engages hostile sexism, right? So differentially depending whether it's a male or female candidate. So that's hostile sexism. Benevolent sexism, not so much, right? So here, the impact of benevolent sexism with a male or a female Democrat running against a Republican is 0, and not just statistically insignificant, but 0. Over here, it looks kind of like maybe something's going on. The difference between these lines is not statistically significant. There are not that many female Republicans in the sample, so asterisk, right? If we believe it, it seems a little weird, right? In fact, we would not expect benevolent sexists to get more likely to vote for a female Republican. I have a post hoc account of why maybe we might believe that, but given that it's not super statistically significant, I'll leave that for the Q&A. Except that I see Paul looking at me.
No, I'm just musing.
Yeah, so muse.
I don't think it's surprising. But maybe that's because I'm at your post hoc.
Yeah, I don't anymore, but
Right.
I'm trying to be a little honest about. I wouldn't have predicted it. Let's put it that way.
Pre-registered this one.
I would not have pre-registered that finding, right? And so, but anyway, there might be some interesting stuff to explore there with some other data. Then, just to continue beating the dead house horse, I also looked at approval of one's current member of Congress. Same basic model, hostile sexism, benevolent sexism, the member sex, both of those interacted with member sex plus respondent and member party ID and their interaction and the kitchen sink. And what I find here is consistent with what I found for vote, right? So if you have a male member of Congress, hostile sexism, as you get more hostily sexist, you approve of him a bit more. If you have a female member of Congress, as you get more hostily sexist, you approve of her quite a bit less. Benevolent sexism, not so much. Okay, so at the presidential level, hostile matters a lot, benevolent matters, but notably less. In Congress, hostile seems to matter, benevolent doesn't seem to matter. Now I turn to an experiment, a conjoint experiment, ooh la la. where this gives me the opportunity to explore not just the impact of sex category, that is whether the candidate or member is male or female, but also gender in the sort of broader sense of how a person enacts their sex category, right? So masculinity and femininity, essentially. And so here in this experiment, I'm manipulating the sex category, whether the candidate's male or female, signaled with a traditionally male or female first name. So we're not hitting respondents over the head with, here's a male candidate, but here's someone with a male name. And also gendered traits, right? So they're described as having a leadership style that's either stereotypically feminine, saying that they collaborate and cooperate with others, or traditionally masculine, that they act decisively and take charge. And those two trait descriptors, or leadership styles, correspond with key dimensions of social judgment more broadly, which are warmth and communality on the one hand, and individualism and agency on the other, and with sort of dimensions of candidate evaluation, trait evaluation of empathy and leadership, all of which are likewise sort of similarly gendered. So this is a conjoint experiment, and in a conjoint, respondents face a pair of two fictitious candidates, and they're asked to choose between the two. They do this repeatedly for 4 different pairs of candidates. And each pair of candidates, for each candidate, they're presented their name, which tells the sex category, their leadership style, their party ID, their effectiveness as a legislator. This is related to Craig Volden's research interests. Their education, either a college degree or an Ivy League degree, and their prior experience that they held state level office or that they're new to politics, right? So
independents too, Nick, or just Democrats and Republicans?
no, so the candidates are always either a Democrat or a Republican. Yeah, right. So these are, well, in fact, right, so here's what they see.
Sorry, yeah.
No, it's a good question. And so, and each of these things is independently and with equal probability chosen, right? So any combination of all of these could appear. Sometimes we have Democrats running against Democrats, sometimes we have Democrats running against Republicans, so on and so forth, right? So, and so then the model estimation is a regression with an indicator variable or dummy variable for each dimension, plus hostile and benevolent sexism, and the interactions between hostile and benevolent and candidate sex on the one hand and the candidate traits on the other hand, respondent partisanship, and respondent by candidate partisanship, right? Estimation is kind of standard approach for conjoint experiments following Hain-Mueller et al., where we're estimating the probability that you choose the candidate averaged over all the different possible opponents. So what is the impact on the probability of voting for a candidate that they are, have prior experience as opposed to not, averaging over all the other things and the effects they have. And the estimates are clustered by respondent, which deals with the fact that the choices that a respondent makes are likely correlated with each other. So here's just the basic model, not including ambivalent sexism, just to get a sense that the conjoint kind of worked the way we might expect. So we see there's no real preference, or maybe a tiny statistically insignificant preference for a female as opposed to a male candidate. So this kind of corresponds to the when women run, women win. Voters are not apt to vote against female candidates per se. In 2016, it's not shocking that they are about almost 8 points more likely to vote for a collaborative candidate than not. The interaction between candidate gender and trait, on the other hand, is, again, literally 0, right? So they have a slight preference for collaborative as opposed to masculine candidates, but that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the sex category is. So this is Democratic candidate, Republican candidate, Democratic respondent, Republican candidate, and then all the interactions. This boils down to the amazing finding that Republicans like Republican candidates more, Democrats like Democratic candidates more. That's pretty symmetric. Independents are pretty much in the middle. Lo and behold, people prefer highly effective candidates, all else equal. don't really care if they held a prior level office, and maybe they don't like Ivy League candidates compared to non-Ivy League candidates, but it's small. Yes.
Do you know what percentage of the people saw co-partisans as candidates? And do the results hold if you get rid of those? Just because I'm imagining that if you're thinking about evaluating candidates in a primary versus a general,
Right.
the impact of all factors might be relatively different.
Yes. So I don't have the figure with me, but I ran separately the models I'm about to show you in what I call primary elections and general elections, where primaries are. So it's, half the time the candidates will match, half the times they won't because they're all independent. And basically the impact of the sexism stuff gets stronger in the primary, which is exactly what one would expect because, they're not able to fall back on partisanship. So, okay, so everyone clear on the basic result? Okay, so now what I'm really interested in is the impact of hostile sexism differentially depending on candidate sex and candidate traits, right? So first, candidate sex. And so this is, if it's a feminine candidate, right, collaborative, cooperative, who is either male, blue line, or female, red line, the impact of hostile sexism. Right, so for a male candidate, hostile sexism is all but irrelevant for the evaluation of that male candidate, but hostile sexism is engaged by a female candidate, right? And again, the operation here, the work of hostile sexism is both at the low egalitarian end and maybe even a little bit less at the higher inegalitarian or sexist end. So this parallels the presidential and the congressional, right, that I saw before. Interestingly, given the mean of hostile sexism, there's very little difference here, which is, again, sort of consistent with when women, in the aggregate, women and men are not advantaged or disadvantaged, though among different kinds of voters, in fact, it looks like they are. Now, among masculine candidates, we get the same contrast in slopes, if anything a little sharper, where hostile sexists the more hostile sexist you are, the more you like a masculine man, and the less you like a masculine woman, right? So the thing I was looking for here was this contrast between male and female, male and female. It's a little sharpened among those who are masculine, right? So again, that parallels what we've seen so far. Now turning to benevolent sexism, among feminine candidates, benevolent sexists don't like feminine candidates pretty much regardless of their sex, right? They particularly don't like male feminine candidates, but they also don't like female feminine candidates, and the difference between these two is absolutely not statistically significant, or substantively, really. And among masculine candidates, as benevolent sexism increases, support for a masculine candidate goes up, again, regardless of whether it's a man or a woman. Maybe a little sharper for men, but again, substantively and statistically, fairly indistinguishable. And the contrast between these, I can kind of sharpen them, by, here we've got a male candidate who's either feminine or masculine, right? So these are the same thing we just saw, but now with the charts rearranged, right? So a masculine male candidate, as benevolent sexism goes up, preference for the masculine male candidate goes up, preference for the feminine male candidate goes down. Same thing, slightly less sharp for female candidates. So what this means is what benevolent sexists like are masculine candidates regardless of whether they are male or female. And what they dislike are feminine candidates regardless of whether they're male or female. While hostile sexism reacts to male or female without much regard to the traits. And the interactions between traits and gender, candidate gender, and sexism doesn't change the story at all. So I then explored a little more the impact of benevolent sexism on support for candidates of each type. And so, again, what I found already, what I showed you already, is that the impact of benevolent sexism on male as opposed to female candidates doesn't matter. Benevolent sexists dislike collaborative candidates. They like decisive candidates. That's exactly what I've shown you so far. Benevolent sexists also like experienced candidates and dislike inexperienced candidates. They like those-ish, I mean, it's statistically marginal, but they like Ivy League candidates and don't like college degree candidates, and they don't much care about effectiveness. So if we look at all of this, benevolent sexists like masculine candidates, and they like candidates who have all of the sort of trappings of traditional, symbolically masculine, if not literally masculine, political authority, which I think is very consistent with the conceptualization of benevolent sexism as it's as much about the purity of women as about the protective, strong protective role of men, and that I think this is getting picked up in the political realms. Where hostile sexism, right, creates a polarization and evaluation of male versus female candidates, not really on traits, although a bit, and nothing else. So hostile and benevolent are quite different in ways that I think make sense given their natures. So next steps are to explore the role of ambivalent sexism in policy opinion. I alluded to a little bit about reactions to abortion and to rape scenarios, but I think there's more work to be done there in the kind of broader public opinion world. And also some consideration of the extent to which benevolent sexism, as I've talked about it, is really about white gender roles and for white people more broadly. Because, again, as I suggested, this kind of chivalry scenario of the white knight in shining armor protecting the damsel in distress from the dastardly, symbolically, if not literally, man of color who might be doing harm to her, right? That scenario is simultaneously gendered and racialized. So one thing, this is the study that's in the field, or hopefully it's out of the field by now, in the current CCES, is an experiment around support for gun control and gun rights and so forth, where in one condition, a person who's buying a gun is quoted as saying that as a husband and a father, it's my job to protect my wife and family against violent criminals. The idea is this should evoke this kind of protective paternalism that benevolent sexists valorize. The crime condition, I want to be ready to protect myself against violent criminals. So the idea here is this still has crime, but not in this kind of family gendered way. There's work out there that shows that this evokes those who are higher in measures of racism are affected by this. So I'm hoping the family and crime conditions will kind of peel apart. And then a hunting condition that tries to situate guns not in the realm of crime, but rather sport. And here's where the race comes in. This is presented with one of two versions of the picture where this guy who's buying the gun either appears white or appears African American. And thanks to Mark Edwards, whose Photoshop skills helped us to take a picture of as it turns out, light-skinned African American man from the Washington Post and kind of adjust his skin tone one way or the other to produce this. So I'll see you next year, hopefully with some exciting results about that. And with that, I'll thank you and ask for questions. Yes?
Okay. So it seems to me that a piece that's missing from this is the kinds of attitudes and cues that the candidates themselves disseminate in their own messaging, right? And so those can be explicit, which would probably be more appealing to hostile sexists. They could be implicit, which might be more appealing to benevolent sexists. But there is work to show that people make these evaluations not only in a vacuum, right, but also based on, what's going on in a campaign.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So I suspect and I speculate in the paper that if we are to believe the conjoint results, right, that suggests that the signals candidates send, beyond the signal of I am male or I am female, but the kind of gendered, how do I enact, am I a manly man? Am I a sensitive new age guy? Am I a proper lady? Am I, an aggressive, feminazi? All of those kinds of signals. I think signal what I was trying to signal with the trait manipulation in the experiment, right? And so I suspect, and I would like to find ways to measure candidate gender traits on the campaign trail, right? So if I had a measure of congressional candidates and members of Congress and how masculine or feminine their sort of enactment of their leadership role is, I suspect that I would find that that was kind of engaged particularly by benevolent sexism. And if I had that, in the fictitious figure in my head, so, I would have the non-effects for benevolent sexism interacted with candidate sex, but interacted with this imaginary measure of candidate gendering, I might get some effects there.
I mean, so I don't know when the 2016 CMAC data become available.
After 2018.
So they have the words, right? And so what Danny and I had done for 2010 and 2014 was we coded words according to leadership, empathy, integrity, and competence, but there were like 250 different words that we characterized. The other is from scraping tweets and using the same dictionary, you can see the kinds of ways that they're describing themselves. And we actually found, unexpectedly, a pretty high correlation between the tweets and the campaign ad language.
Right.
So one or the other is probably fine.
Yeah, they're reasonable proxies.
Yeah, so I wonder if just even a rough proxy of that, once those data are available, would at least lend support to the idea that what you're finding is also consistent with the messages the candidates themselves are putting out. Yeah,
no, I think that's a really good suggestion. Also, Adam Hughes, former grad student, now at Pew Data Labs, they've done a big project with scraping and kind of automating analysis of congressional press releases. So that would be sort of a third proxy measure. I like the idea. So there's the code those kind of laboriously for how masculine or feminine they are, which nobody can be reliable about that I've ever figured out. But now there's all this big data stuff on the kind of position of different words on all kinds of dimensions, including things that might proxy masculine and feminine. I think you're right that with a couple different measurement strategies, just a kind of automated mess, noisy, but
right. Because I just think that would show that it's these attitudes that are actually driving people's opinions, and not that, in the face of a different campaign, they would have completely different views.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Paul.
And on that exact point, to go back to this interesting little finding about the Republican women, if Jen is right and if the conjoint is right, to the extent that those candidates present as more masculine in their leadership style, then it's not surprising at all, right? That benevolent sexists gravitate towards those women candidates.
Right. If it is the case that female Republicans, on average, present as more masculine in a variety of ways, then that is very consistent with that finding.
They're running against less masculine Democratic men.
Right. This would really not be surprising if they are running campaigns that are seeking to position themselves as strong Republican leaders, not, as opposed to that soft,
exactly,
ineffective Democrat. I have a paper that shows that masculine and feminine are themselves linked both implicitly and explicitly with Democratic and Republican in people's minds. So again, these can kind of build. There's a way in which female Republicans could be drawing on the implicit masculinity of the Republican brand to counteract an assumption of femininity that voters might otherwise make.
So a follow-up that's actually a completely different question. You call this ambivalent sexism, but you don't have a measure of that. You're just showing what happens with hostile and what happens with benevolent. And so the real question is, the real question for ambivalent sexists what happens to the people in the opposite cell that Jim was asking about, the people who are high on both?
So, okay, so there's a narrow data analysis answer to that question and a broader conceptual. So the
Yeah.
narrower one is the interaction between hostile and benevolent never does anything, though, you know, it's already a model with a bunch of different interactions, so, you know, there might be something subtle, but I mean, there's not some huge interaction that I can find in these data. That's the narrower. The broader, so you said I call it, I call it ambivalent sexism because Glick and Fisk call it ambivalent sexism. I find that term, and the more I've presented this paper to political science audiences, the more I find that term misleading. And so I probably will find, you know, while making clear that I'm not trying to say I didn't lift this from Glick and Fisk, I probably will need to move away from using that term. I mean, their point is that if one thinks about a man who is high in both of these things, that man has simultaneous positive and negative affect toward the broad category women. And that is ambivalence. But what they really say is that that man has positive toward, doesn't think about the category women, thinks about these subcategories and differentiates them. And so at that point, the sense in which it's ambivalent, you know, that these are two conflicting emotions, loses, I think, some of its power. And so, yeah. Jim.
Would there have been any value to controlling for demographics like age, sex, and region of these respondents?
Sure. I mean,
People in the South, for example, react differently than Pacific Northwest. Do Generation Z people react differently than baby boomers?
yes.
So on?
Right. So what I would be interested in controlling for or running separate analyses for are characteristics that we think either are correlated with sexism and themselves have an effect, and so we might be picking up an age effect and calling it a sexism effect, or things where we think, you know, the sort of complex of sexism the cognitions around sexism may be systematically different in the North versus the South. So I did look at North versus South, didn't really find anything. I haven't looked at age, but I think
Gender,
it is a good, yeah, so respondent gender does not matter. You know, just running parallel analyses among men and women, all the findings are still there, and the differences between the two are noise. So respondent gender does not matter, which in fact is what I would expect, right? Because given the construction of this ideology in gender integrated environments of family and most of life, we would not expect men and women to have they may fall at different places on the benevolent and hostile scale, but we wouldn't expect them to have sort of fundamentally different beliefs about how gender works or how it connects to politics. And that's in fact what I find. Age and region, I think, would bear a little further exploration, because certainly the way, like this gender ideology, I think is particularly rampant in the southern United States, kind of connects with things like culture of honor and so forth, that might make this stronger in the South. I didn't really find that, but there's probably more.
You might not have found it because candidates know that. And so they're in some ways recalibrating their campaigns or how they're presenting themselves, aware of the environment they're in. So
Yeah,
that's why I always think the sociodemographics of the voters are sort of like...
Yeah, it's the campaign is endogenous
Yeah.
to that stuff. I didn't find anything in the conjoint either, but still, I mean, this is not the most powerful design to tease out those sorts of effects. So I think the most I can say is that there's not some demographic effect that's, you know, this stuff is not spuriously just kind of created by some demographic difference. I don't feel like I have strong enough information to really make the stronger claim that, oh yes, this holds everywhere and with all ages of voters and so forth. So I think that definitely bears more investigation. Yeah.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about things to add to the model, I was wondering, where do you think political engagement fits in with this? Like, do you think that as someone engages more in politics, perhaps sexist attitudes are less predictive of voting behavior because they're getting more information, so this is serving more as a shortcut. Perhaps hostile sexism decreases, but benevolent sexism remains. Or sort of cynically, the more I participate, the more this sort of gets reaffirmed, becomes more predictive of how I'm going to behave.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think as soon as I have a measure of anything about campaigns, I'm going to want to include interactions with engagement. I mean, because, the sort of standard, of course, people who are paying more attention are going to get more of that treatment, if we want to think of it that way. My prior is to lean toward your latter cynical view that, this stuff isn't some pre and apolitical set of attitudes that people bring to politics until they really learn about politics, and then they set that stuff aside and think, politically. I think this stuff is, I talked about it being forged in the intimate family context, but it's also forged and reinforced in the social and the political context, and so candidates are, so when a candidate runs on being, a strong leader who's going to protect America from its enemies, that's the kind of thing that forges a connection between benevolent sexism and politics, not the sort of thing that would undermine it. But again, without measures of the campaigns, I'm speculating. Yeah, Cal.
So my question is just more about the conjoint experiment, and particularly when you're looking at subgroup differences. So when you're looking at subgroup differences, am I correct in assuming that what you're presenting here is within that Heinmuller framework of the average marginal interaction effect? Is that what you're showing?
No, what I'm showing here is the average probability of voting. Right, so I'm dealing with whoever it is, 2018, Leaper 2018.
Okay. So I just wanted to make sure the baselines.
Yeah. And if you want to know more, if the rest of you want to know what that, so in the conjoint analysis, the various effects are all contingent on what the baseline omitted category. Also, all of these are 2, so it would just be the inverse. So all of the estimated effects are relative to the omitted baseline category. So if you have a multi-level treatment, then the impact of that treatment category is versus the omitted category. And so then if we're looking at the effect of that treatment among men versus among women, if they have a different level for the baseline, then the treatment difference, a difference in the impact of that category may reflect a difference in that baseline, not in the category itself. Not to worry, I'm cool, is the short version of how I'm handling this. Yeah.
So this is just a small question, but one of your variables in your experiment was background, and you just had elected background, I believe.
Wait.
In the experiment with the experience of the candidates.
Yeah.
So I noticed, and it may just be anecdotal, I don't know how many of these actually there were, but some candidates who won really interesting races, Democrats, stressed their military backgrounds. And I'm curious about how you fit that into.
Yeah,
So I was just going to say, one thing that strikes me as I'm listening to you is that this may be an effective ploy against benign sexism. And so these women may come from those areas, may be particularly effective in those districts. I'm thinking suburbs. I think this would really work.
Yeah.
In suburbs, there's swing districts. But anyway, it's just something I was thinking about as you were talking.
Yeah. So if this had been my module and I didn't need to include, say, effectiveness, I said to Craig, that I will give up data analysis and experimental research if he finds that people do not prefer highly effective candidates. The interesting question, though, is if it's an out partisan, do you prefer highly effective, or you might prefer highly ineffective because you want the other side not to be doing a very good job? In my quick look at that, it seems like people just like effective. They're not being that
Smart.
subtle, smart, strategic.
But big
But anyway,
Oh, I'm sorry.
but back to your question. So yeah,
I didn't think you were answering that.
I'm fascinated to think. I'm fascinated to think about the deployment of two sorts of very common imagery. One is military experience, right, both for men and for women. Seems like an obvious connection to the sort of protective paternalistic, like I'm strong, and so forth. I mean, it also signals some other things, so one would have to be thoughtful about that. And that's something that, in fact, that would be easy to collect and kind of see if military vet status, even not measuring how much it's emphasized in the campaign, might really good. The other one I'm really interested in is the use of motherhood, which my sense is back in the day, signaled sort of warmth and compassion and so forth. But now there's a lot of the, hell, I managed a household with 5 kids. Like, this is child's play. Where it's really, there's something very different going on there than, I'm mom serving you apple pie and I'm warm and compassionate. It's, so there's the I want to say Tiger Mud, hockey mom of Sarah Palin, but that sort of imagery gets used a lot, and that's mixing and kind of creating new sets of subcategories that I think in the long run are probably helpful for both male and female candidates to have a broader array of kind of archetypes or so forth on which to draw. So like you're not just a female candidate, you're a, tough mom, Air Force vet. And that's a kind of a known entity, at least in the abstract for voters, gives female candidates and also male candidates for that matter more flexibility. But yeah, it's sort of on the agenda somewhere to get more systematic about that. Yeah.
So given that the definition of benevolent sexism kind of includes, is really integral, protectionism is really integral part of that, and the kind of chivalry example you're giving, you're emphasizing the fact that it's a man of color that's being protected from, but also I think you weren't as explicit that typically we're also thinking of the woman being a white woman that we're protecting.
Right.
And so I guess I'm wondering how much you're considering the race of the female candidates.
So in this analysis, not at all. More broadly, yes, that's absolutely. So there are a couple ways to go with that. So I'll actually answer a slightly different question. I'll answer the question I thought you were going to ask first, and then I'll try to answer the question you did ask. So one question, another way to frame the is benevolent sexism for white people question is to look at an analysis only among white respondents, where the argument is that this whole paradigm of the relationship in the family as a kind of metaphor for the relationship in politics, of a protected man, yada, yada, works best, if at all, in a kind of stereotypical white context. As is often the case with a nationally representative sample, I really don't have enough cases of respondents of color to be able to tell very well. The results get a little stronger when it's just among white respondents, which is a hint that that in fact may be the case, but again, not enough to know. In terms of racial category of candidates, absolutely, I would expect that the ability, for example, of male or female candidates to trade on gendered imagery is going to certainly be conditioned by the racial context. And with observational data, again, it's the study of the interactions between candidate sex category and candidate race ethnicity category today is, I think, where the study of female candidates at the national level was in the kind of early 80s, where there were some candidates, but not enough to be confident that our results are not kind of really about the proper noun of whichever handful of candidates we've got. But I think that's exactly right, and it's an area that experimental work, we need. There's again starting to be some, but we need more. My students in my undergrad seminar last semester, I'd have them construct a little experiment and run it among a bunch of other undergrads. And a couple of them did a kind of version of that, and you know, it was underpowered study, but they got results that were kind of hinted that that's exactly right. So that was kind of cool to see. And a good question.